No, that's fine. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's our privilege today to host a speech and discussion on the record with Saudi Arabia's Minister of Finance, His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan. We are very fortunate at all times that the Peterson Institute is a venue for substantive discussion and for policymakers of strong global intent to come set out their views and occasionally even take questions. We're very privileged, I use that word again intentionally, to have the minister with us today. As most of you know, he is also the sitting chair of the IMFC and plays a number of roles representing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the global economy. He is a board member inside Saudi Arabia of the Public Investment Fund, a board member of Saudi Aramco, the chairman of the General Authority of State Real Estate, but also he represents the kingdom as a member of the OPEC Ministerial Council for the International Development Fund, a member of the Governor's Board of the International Monetary Fund, as I mentioned, IMFC, heads the kingdom's delegations to the meetings of finance ministers and central bank governors to the G20, governor of the kingdom at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a member of the Governor's Board of the Islamic Development Bank, member of the Governor's Board of the Arab Financial Institutions, and a member of the Council of Arab Finance Ministers. Even by the standards of global officials, I do not know how he has any time to sleep or think, but anyone who has heard the minister speak or seen him in international meetings knows that he is energetic, forceful, clear, smart. And for that reason alone, we're very glad to have him here at the start of this week's observance of the annual meetings and the many issues facing the global system today. With that, please allow me to welcome the minister to the Peterson Institute today.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was possibly an overstated introduction, but thank you. I will accept it. I will try to be as brief as I can, and I promise you will be able to go home and have dinner before 10 p.m. So just make sure that you have enough coffee. Otherwise, you will fall asleep. So, again, thank you very much, really, for having me. And good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking you, Adam, and the rest of the Peterson Institute for organizing this event, inviting me to speak during the Macro Week. It is really good to be among friends and allies in both policy and practice. The Peterson Institute has a distinguished, indeed very distinguished history of promoting rigorous inquiry about economic policy while outlining the best pathways to achieve inclusive global prosperity. Today, I would like to talk about some of those pathways. But first, I need to talk about one of the most important challenges standing in our way. We all can see that the world is becoming more and more fragmented. It is more difficult to build consensus on regional security, trade, development, and countless other issues. Nations are becoming more self-isolating. And as a non-native, I came across this expression of self-isolating during COVID. But I've always thought that actually you do self-isolation to protect the others, not really to protect from others. But unfortunately, it is used the other way around. Obviously, there are political and economic instability regionally and globally, and individual nations are finding it very difficult to succeed if they are surrounded by failed states or nations with very weak growth prospects. Yet, I'm optimist, seriously optimist. And I think one day, and hopefully not far away from today, we'll find our way back to collaboration. One of the root causes of the current multilateralism crisis is actually we lost trust in the system. Multiple shocks globally have actually shaken our confidence on multilateralism. And the issue is multilateralism has actually helped us individually and nation-wise for decades. The world flourished, economies have grown, and we really benefited. But unfortunately, over the last at least 4 or 5 years, that system has faced a lot of blocks and challenges. The key of these, in my opinion, is the unequal growth or opportunity within nations and between nations. And if we take one example I was talking about on the way coming down here, is if you think about even the most advanced economies who benefited a lot, who grew a lot over the last few decades, you will find a lot of the people who are calling for what we call fragmentation and protectionism are those who are largely left behind, even within advanced economies. Many leaders obviously will take their own country's interest as a priority, which is obviously understandable. However, if not carefully balanced, you will likely benefit short term, but it will haunt you and your country and your people in the medium term and long term. So wisdom is called for. Collapse of multilateralism could indeed be a leading indicator of the failure of individual states. And this would benefit none of us. The truth is, we face common challenges. And to be successful, it is in our self-interest to collaborate both regionally and globally. It is the time really to build bridges, not burn them. We need to embrace collaboration even when it is politically difficult, because at the end, we will all benefit. We have to repair bridges of multilateralism that connect us through trade, investment, intellectual property, technology, development, and the movement of skilled labor. The more connected and interdependent, the more likely that nations will seek to protect their interest through dialogue. And perhaps some conflicts can be avoided. Some say that multilateralism have peaked. Some countries are now doubting that such cooperation is in their interest. I will reflect on a few things. A couple of weeks back, at the same meeting, or the same meeting room, where the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were born, I tagged along with few thought leaders to think about the 80th anniversary of both institutions. And it was really, really clear to me that there were lessons to be learned from those meetings that were held 80 years ago. Wise people like you would agree, I'm sure, that we really don't need a devastating war for us to come together to create multilateral institutions. We have them. We just need to enhance them. And it would really be foolish, absolutely foolish, to waste these institutions. The current challenges on multilateralism gives us the space to think more broadly about how global institutions can serve all of our interests. It is easy to forget that the delegates at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944, at the height of the World War II, could not have anticipated all the coming challenges, technologies, political movements, and conflicts. In fact, they would not know when and how the terrible war would end. But they did have a common vision: to prevent the second half of the 20th century from being as violent and destructive as the first half. There was an awakening to the idea that new global organizational structure were needed, that nations could jointly address many shared challenges. This was the first true test of institutional multilateralism. The IMF and the World Bank were imperfect, but they were useful tools to help rebuild the world. These two institutions, along with the United Nations and the WTO, were an experiment in cooperative multilateral governance, trying to do things together that we cannot achieve alone. At Bretton Woods, the participants were in conflict about the nature of economic growth, the role of the state, and the idea of self-governing for new countries that were just beginning to emerge. Since that time, many things have changed. Monetary standards, exchange rates, financial institutions, technology, and modes of economic collaboration, among others. In fact, most of the countries where the IMF and the World Bank do business today did not exist in 1944 when they were born. And the bank and the IMF have continued to evolve to address new challenges in new contexts. Finance, markets, and trade are more interconnected than ever before, providing new opportunities and new risks. New technologies, such as robotics and AI, will continue to put stress on economies and social infrastructure. And we need the IMF and the World Bank, amongst others, to help us through. There is no end to the evolution of multilateral institutions. We should just get used to it. We have seen that the world economic power has shifted, as other emerging groups of nations now have a larger share of the global GDP than the G7, increasing the incomes and the well-being of billions of people. Emerging market nations have populations that are younger, more adaptable, and indeed more engaged in their economies, and with equal stake in the future global economy. Institutional reform must continue to adjust quickly and decisively to solve tough problems such as poverty, inequality, climate pressures, and energy in ways which respect the new power structure and their diverse situations. This is the lesson of Bretton Woods. It is essential for us to strengthen multilateral action. A fractured and conflicted international community will negatively impact industrialized nations. But unfortunately, it will also devastate low-income countries who are hoping to lift themselves up. We must strengthen multilateral action, not only to address current risks, but also to promote future sustainable economic growth and human development for the greatest number of people on this planet. This week, at the IMF, the institution will be working to ensure that global economic growth remains resilient while creating jobs, boosting productivity, and ensuring that inflation returns to target. As the IMFC chair, I support the managing director's vision to ensure that the IMF's surveillance of risks, its lending toolkit, and capacity development all remain well-equipped to support its members. The continuation of institutional reform will be important to ensure that the IMF remains strong and representative. And indeed, the addition of a 25th chair in the IMF Executive Board will strengthen the voice and representation of the IMF low-income members. Over the past 80 years, we have learned that if countries want to prosper, they have to grow. This means, in part, that they will need to tap the global trading system and engage effectively. And of course, that system will always require maintenance. The benefits from trade can be uneven, but every country must have a strategy to maximize their position in the world markets. New research by this institution demonstrates the negative impact of tariffs and how they could really damage individual nations and the world economy. Trade is an essential component for both growth and development. In Africa, 12 million young people will join workforce every year in the coming decades. Yet, Africa can only create 3 million formal paid jobs. This is a serious crisis because these young adults want to support their families, their nations, their communities. Denying them that ability is a very serious risk to the stability of that region, but globally. And we are seeing that impact today. Ask Europe. To succeed, Africa's economy must grow and create jobs, in part through international trade. Africa needs collaboration and help of the global and regional institutions to succeed in managing their scarce resources while engaging in trade and development. MDBs, or multilateral development banks or institutions, need to increase their focus on capacity building. The evolution of the World Bank and the IMF should be reflected in their operations, including regionalization and even localization of their work. In the MENA region, where I come from, the new IMF regional office in Riyadh will seek to provide hands-on support to members to manage their difficult fiscal challenges. Saudi Arabia will provide $279 million to support this initiative over the next 10 years, because we know that a stronger regional economy will benefit us all. We also need to be careful to monitor structural risks, such as sovereign debt. A recent IMF report estimates that the global public debt is projected to exceed $100 trillion this year and could represent about 100% of the global GDP by 2030. Most low-income nations now, and this is very scary, most low-income countries today spend on their debt service more than their education spend, healthcare spend, and climate action spend combined, just for the debt service. These debt challenges are nearly impossible for developing nations to manage without multilateral support. During the Saudi G20 presidency in 2020, Saudi led the effort to create the Global Debt Restructuring Forum, called the Common Framework for Debt Treatment. It combines Paris Club creditors and non-Paris Club creditors and facilitates discussions with private sector stakeholders to help accelerate stalled negotiations with debtors. We saw this as a mechanism to promote effective action on debt relief. But again, it requires constant maintenance. Now, we need to formalize the common framework because it offers nations a very balanced way out of debt distress. This is part of the Kingdom's commitment to helping developing nations achieve their economic and development goals. Saudi Arabia today is amongst the top global aid donors as a percentage of gross national income, according to the OECD. And we are doing it, again, for self-interest. I've said this before, and I will say it again. If nations think about this as part of their self-interest, they will think differently about multilateralism and support and humanitarian aid. This leads me actually to spend just a couple of minutes to briefly update you on what is happening in Saudi Arabia. We are really committed on delivering on a strong economy for our people. We really believe that you can best help from a position of strength. Each country should deliver on their own ambitious fiscal and economic goals, fixing their own roofs before advising others to fix theirs. In Saudi Arabia, we are in the middle of the implementation of Saudi Vision 2030, which aims to transform and diversify the economy, focusing on growth. Saudi Arabia has many strengths, and I would invite you really to visit Saudi Vision website, which has significant up-to-date statistics, data points that will help provide a clear understanding of the significant change that is taking place in Saudi Arabia. But for the sake of time, I will focus on one important thing. We are a very young nation, a vibrant population. About 70% of the Saudi population are under the age of 35. Our young workforce is driving the transformation. They are really embracing the change. They are moved by the long-term plan and being part of that change. They are open to change, and indeed, they are very innovative. It is critical that we involve everyone, and that's why Saudi women are gaining a greater role in the economy. Women workforce participation increased from 16%, 16%, in 2016 when we launched Vision 2030, to reach 36% in 23, which actually exceeds our 2030 target of 30%, 7 years earlier. That's how engaged the community. That's how the change in the social activity and economic engagement is happening. 2/3 of these women are actually working in the private sector. And we really tried to make sure that that transition is as smooth as possible, providing childcare, transportation, training, and incentivizing employers to employ women and train them. Not only as employees, today we have double the SMEs that we had 6 years ago. And today, 45% of SMEs in Saudi Arabia are owned by women. That's a major shift in economy and productivity. These young women and men are indeed our future. And the Saudi transformation is designed to benefit them and their children. I know very confidently that many proud fathers and mothers exist in Saudi Arabia, including myself, who all have personal stake on this transformation. This is, I'm sure, very true to all of you here. It's your kids and their kids' future that we are working towards and need to make bold decisions, long-term commitments for their own sake. We are all trying to make the world safer, more prosperous, not just for ourselves, but also for generations to come. And this is why, going back, the reforms of the multilateral institutions are so important. They are a renewal of our commitment to a common vision of global peace and prosperity, not only for us, for everyone. Like the participants in the Bretton Woods 80 years ago, we cannot really know with certainty what lies ahead. But we can commit, indeed commit together to face it and deal with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Al-Jadaan, for your visionary talk and speaking from a place of both personal and global motivation. There are so many topics, but you came back to the issue of IMF, World Bank reform, calling at the 80th anniversary, time to reconsider. So could I ask you to go into a bit more depth on what are some of the reforms you want to see, either in terms of the mandate or in terms of the governance and voting shares? What do you think you want to change for the better at the fund right now?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you again, really, for having me. I think the 80th anniversary actually provides a very opportune time to look back at the two institutions and the current challenges and see what can we do differently. And I think that have started already, that process have started. In the World Bank, that process is now almost a year in the making, with a new vision, new mission, and clarity on what really needs to be done. I think the core mandate is absolutely accurate, and we don't need to change it. We need the two institutions. One is dealing with poverty and prosperity, and one is dealing with the financial system and dealing with shocks. But we really need to make sure that for the IMF, we need a lot more surveillance. We need a lot more risk anticipation. And we need a lot more capacity development. And in capacity development, for example, I think when we talk about capacity development, whether it is in the IMF or the World Bank, we talk about them in the context of emerging markets, low-income countries who need help. But actually, capacity development is needed from these two institutions to advanced economies as much. It's really the voice of independent institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that is needed in advanced economies to make sure that their policies are put in check. Because they are not impacting their own policies, but they are impacting actually the global economy. The second is really making sure both institutions that they mobilize their resources adequately and efficiently. And it's a lot easier really to ask members for money. It's more difficult really actually to say, are we utilizing our money the way it should be? Is there ways really to be more efficient? Is there a way really to mobilize private sector with you? And I can tell you from very limited experience in the global scene in Saudi Arabia, you need to mobilize private sector. You will not be able to succeed alone. No matter how much money you have, you just cannot do it alone. You need to mobilize your private sector. The same applies to the World Bank, for example. I think the third is making sure that both institutions spend more energy in giving tailored advice. One-size-fits-all policy does not work. And with even a complex economy regionally and in individual countries, you really need to have more focus on individual countries that you are advising to make sure that your advice and recommendations are fit for that country's circumstances. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you. To follow up, one of the areas where, partly due to your leadership, there has been progress was the decision on surcharges recently. And obviously the existence of the common framework for dealing with debt, sovereign debt. Right now, though, of course, we are a couple of years into the common framework, and the debt situation of a number of middle and low-income economies is quite severe still. How do you, the surcharges will help, but what do you see as the next steps for the agenda to get people to either restructure or use the common framework, or what's your vision for getting us out of this debt trap?
Few things. First of all, at least we have a structure. We have a framework that deals with debt distress and debt restructuring. We did not have that before. And I would say, again, as I said earlier, I think we should just build on it. We should improve it, enhance it, formalize it even more so that it's clear what needs to be done, what are the process, what the time frame is. I mean, when we started, the first country took like 2 years through the process. The second country took about 18 months. The third country took about 12 months. Now, I think the last country was Ghana, and it was done in about 4 months, 5 months. But that's not enough because it's a learning process. So you really need also to have some form of a secretariat for this forum, where countries in need would actually approach that body and understand what the requirements are. Second, we really need to work hard to remove the stigma out of this. A lot of countries would avoid approaching the common framework because of the stigma. But ultimately, they do end up approaching it, but then when it is too late even. The third is we really need to consider whether it is appropriate actually to open this not to countries who are in actual distress, but in countries where we know they are heading there if we didn't help them. And I think that support will be more impactful if we do it early on than when they are already under. And there are a lot more ideas.
No, but to hear your priorities, great. Let me tell the audience we're going to give you an opportunity. The minister's graciously consented to take questions. I'm going to ask him one more, and then I'll come to each of you. One of the things you said, I think very effectively in your speech, is the declining amount of trust in the institutions, in the multilateral institutions, and the idea that they exist, we just need to trust them and make use, well, not just, but we need to trust them and make use. I realize you're not a Western politician, but how do you think about rebuilding trust, either in the international community or in some of the publics that have lost trust in these institutions?
Few things. I think one is you need to make sure that you, as much as you can, isolate these institutions from politics. You cannot fix climate change alone. You need every country around the table. And the same with debt, and the same with so many other things. So if you are going to involve politics and everything that you do through these multilateral institutions, you are not going to achieve anything. So that's really number one. Make sure that you will have a platform through these institutions where you could talk even with your enemies. You need a platform to talk with your adversaries. Second, these institutions will also need to communicate better. They will need to show their benefits better to the stakeholders, not only to the recipients of support, but also to the population of the donors' countries. Why does it matter for people in Denmark, or Saudi Arabia, or the US, or Canada, or Japan, to actually provide support to the PRGT, for example? Why do we need the budgetary allocation in these countries, and how is it going to help the mid-person, wherever he is in these donor countries, through that support? I think that will need also to be communicated a lot better. You know, I've said this and I will repeat it. Countries do not do charity. Charity is for individuals and NGOs. Politicians are not empowered to actually give away money as a charity. They are giving it because it is in the interest of your own nation for them to give it to the World Bank or to other organizations. And we need to explain that.
Let me gather the two questions I saw so that we'll have them for the minister. Jessica, it would be Cecilia and Jacob.
Cecilia Malmström, I'm at Peterson. Thank you, Minister, for your strong plea for multilateralism. A third institution that was also the result of the Bretton Woods, even if it was created a little bit later, GATT or WTO, is of course also key for multilateralism, and we know the crisis it is in today. Is Saudi Arabia ready to take a stronger role in reforming and strengthening the WTO as well? And what would be your main goals, apart from your own interests?
Thank you, Cecilia. Before you respond, Jacob, so we'll manage the time.
Yeah, Jacob Kierkegaard, also from Peterson. And I would also like to commend you for your robust defense of multilateralism. And I would like to ask you about a specific potential threat to multilateralism that I think you might be uniquely positioned to comment on, and that is the issue of decarbonization. Because I think that if you look at the global fossil fuel trade, it is inherently global, it is very, very large, and if you look at a world that is fully decarbonized, electrified, etc., it will invariably lead to more self-sufficiency with regards to the primary energy supply around the world. So while obviously critical minerals, the role of China in many of these sectors suggests that trade and multilateralism is important also in a decarbonized world, I would nonetheless venture to say that the trade flows and the international engagement in such an economy will be lower or less than it is today.
Is there a question, Jacob?
Yes, the question is, do you view decarbonization as a potential future threat to multilateralism or not?
Thank you. And could you hand the mic directly behind you, other side, to Annika? Last question.
Sorry. Mr. Minister, thank you so much for, in particular, your remarks on the debt institutions and ways of dealing with debt. I'm struggling with the following problem. Even if we wrote off all of the debt of all of the low and middle income countries, we would have a giant financing gap just for climate financing needs in these countries. And they have limited to no debt carrying capacity. So how do we mobilize the funding and direct it to the right places? What form can it take? I'm not sure it's politically feasible to have grants on that scale. Again, even if we wrote up all of their debt, it's not clear that they should be borrowing this much. How do we mobilize the right kind of financing for these countries? And how do we look at it relative to the debt problem you described?
Thank you. So, Minister, whatever section of the three questions you would care to respond to, please.
I will try to be as brief on WTO. On 2020, during Saudi presidency of the G20, we actually put forward a proposal that was accepted and agreed by the leaders to look at how we can actually reform WTO to be more relevant. But I would not really leave it at that. I would just say, if you read the newspapers and hear, all the media, you would say WTO is dead. WTO is actually alive and kicking and doing very well. And if there are challenges, obviously there will be challenges, but it is actually doing very well. The latest statistics I've seen is that more than 75% of the world trade is done under the WTO terms. So we are still okay. So despite all the negativity around WTO, obviously it needs to be fixed, and obviously we need to work with the members to see a resolution to some of the key impediments, including the dispute resolution mechanism. And your question, I actually will be very brief. I would say no. And for two reasons. One is that it will take a long time, and I hope it could happen tomorrow, but it will take actually a very long time for that to happen. And no matter what technologies, what inventions, what our needs will increase. I mean, if you look at history, what you actually thought would be a luxury is now something that is considered a necessity. You know, people would feel that they really need to have this, even though it's actually not something that they need. And that evolution will happen, you know, generation after generation. You know, our needs will continue to grow. And the fact that we don't have everything in every country is the nature of things. You know, you will still need the trade for you to be able to get what you need and what your people need. And I'll also be very brief on the debt question. And I will forward this question on its head and say, I really would like to hear from the institution, including this institution, how are we going to collectively work together to deal with not only the debt, but also the dire need of these nations. If there is one thing that I would say, and on the risk of being called for, you know, whatever, because I came from Saudi Arabia and we are fossil fuel rich, it is really a real hypocrisy for advanced economies with plenty of wealth to tell development banks, do not give support for African nations or other nations in Asia to actually utilize their own endowment of gas, for example, while advanced economies are still burning the dirtiest coal. That's hypocrisy. So if you allow them to actually use their own endowment of fossil fuel, they will be able actually to help themselves have a cleaner cooking energy. They will be able to help themselves in their connectivity. They will be able to help themselves in being able actually to find a job without leaving home through connectivity and digital economy. So I'll stop there. I will not go even in more details.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Peterson Institute and our global audience, I just want to remind people that the minister's formal remarks and the video of his conversation are available on the Peterson Institute website. And I think it will be a useful guide for everyone watching what develops this week and in coming months and years. Please join me in thanking His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan, the Minister of Finance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you.